In the digital world where shadows lurk and threats hide, there is a secret weapon: threat modeling. But what is threat modeling, and how can it protect your systems from harm? Join us as we delve into the world of threat modeling using the STRIDE framework to identify, analyze, and mitigate risks. Discover the power of proactive security and learn how to safeguard your digital assets. So exactly what is threat modeling? Well, it's a systematic approach used to identify, analyze, and evaluate potential security threats to a system or application. It helps organizations understand and mitigate risks before they can be exploited. It helps to proactively identify vulnerabilities, prioritize risks for mitigation, improve overall system security, and it helps meet compliance requirements. So what is STRIDE? You always hear STRIDE when you deal with any kind of threat modeling framework. So STRIDE is just an acronym. It stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege, and it provides a framework for categorizing potential threats that you might see or that you might develop in a brainstorming session when you're doing the threat model. So you're working for a company as a security engineer in corporate America, and your boss tells you to give me a threat model of our applications. How would you go about doing that using the STRIDE model? Well, number one, threat models are not developed in a vacuum. So you wouldn't just sit there and do it yourself. You need somebody who knows about the application. I would bring in somebody like the development team that makes the application, and also bring in some network engineers or network architects that also know how the application is connected on the network. From there, you can start by defining the system's boundaries. Create like a diagram that's going to show different zones, trusted zones, and untrusted zones to see where threats could potentially come from. You want to identify all the assets of the application and their vulnerabilities. And then you want to analyze the potential impact of a threat. Once you have those listed, then you can prioritize the risks that those threats impose and mitigation strategies. That's what makes a threat model so effective, because you look at the application, you understand all the inputs to the application, the zones and where the traffic is going, the data flow. You understand all these components, and then you look at it and say that, hey, this application can be exploited by doing this, or it has no protection for integrity here, or it doesn't have any confidentiality piece here, or it can be tampered with over there. It can be spoofed. It can be DDoSed. It can be people can elevate their privileges. Our system can elevate their privileges right here. Essentially, you're decomposing the application and assessing what threats could be exploited against this application. And typically, I would recommend that you do the threat model session with the group of your developers, of your network architects, system architects. Do that threat model that one time. What you're going to want to bring to the table, or what you're going to want to have, some data flow diagrams, network diagrams, some application diagrams. You can put that all together, and then you can make the threat model based off of that. I would take those documents, the network diagram, the application diagram with the data flow, and then where it's going to be showing the zones and the trusted areas and the untrusted areas, different protocols that are being used. You can take that before your threat model session with the team and go ahead and make an overlay of how you see the application, making a few assumptions here and there. Then when you have the session with the team, you take and look at that threat model, and then that's when you guys start going through it and figuring out what types of threats could be executed on this type of application the way it sits. There's also an application called Microsoft Threat Modeler, and it's mainly built for Azure right now, but you can use that to kind of build out what you might see as a threat model, just to kind of quickly, and it uses STRIDE as well. So you can just put the inputs in there, put the diagram in there, make some assumptions as far as the traffic and which way the data is flowing, and it'll do an analysis on that, and it'll create a bunch of different threats based off of the STRIDE model. That's a good kind of first draft to take a look at and see what you can use from that and put in the actual threat model. Now, a lot of the threats that you find using an application or program like that, they make a lot of assumptions, but as you drill down into them, you'll see that some of those threats that it finds have already been mitigated by different types of controls, such as authentication or firewall rules or something of that nature. So what you're left with at the end of the threat model assessment is the true threats that could attack, the true threats that could exploit your system. So some common threats that are identified with STRIDE include unauthorized access, data breaches, denial of service attacks, malware infections, and privilege escalation. So once you have all the threats listed, Then you can prioritize the threats by what's the likelihood of this actually occurring? What's the severity if it did occur? How much would it cost to mitigate this? And what are our regulatory compliance requirements that we must have in place that our customers, our different regulations are going to demand? Once you have all this information, you can present this threat model to the team, present it to your higher ups. The CISO may want to see it, I'm sure, and then just different people around the organization. And this threat model work will have a lot of weight because you guys went through the whole ceremony of making this threat model, brainstorming and figuring out what potentially can happen. And this will give the security team more leverage to get what they need, and the business can decide on what they want to mitigate and how they want to mitigate it and what do they want to accept as a risk. So some of the benefits of this would be improved security posture. You have a reduced risk of data breaches, enhanced compliance, increased customer confidence, and also a cost savings by preventing any security incidents. So some of the challenges of threat modeling include, it's a time-consuming process. It takes a little bit of time to get it done and get done right. But as with anything, the more you do it, the faster it will get, and the teams will be able to recognize threats more quickly. It also requires a certain expertise. You need a security professional who is adept in finding risks, understanding the way networks work, understanding applications, and really the big picture of how everything goes together in order to find these threats. And some of these threats, they can be off the wall. It can be so far-fetched. And those are the ones you want to watch out for. You don't want to take it too far. For example, you don't want to say that somebody could infect the system if they had physical access to the cloud in AWS. They had to break into the data center, the typical parachute down or just rappel down into the data center and sneak in and impersonate somebody, that kind of stuff. Some of those are too far-fetched to even have on a threat model. I mean, they're fun just to bring up and just to analyze all the potential threats, but the likelihood of that happening is going to be so low depending on the type of data that you're trying to protect that it's not even worth having on the threat model, because they're more likely to get popped by a phishing email than that happening. So it is a time-consuming process, but some of the tools that you can access are like the threat modeling tool from Microsoft is a good one. And there's also OWASP has something called Threat Dragon. There's PyTM, which is a Python-centric threat modeling tool. There's also CSponge. iRisk has a community edition that can do threat modeling. Threat Composer. So there's several. Actually, there's another one. I think I've used this one before, but SD Elements, which takes a more text-based approach to threat modeling. So how does threat modeling fit into the rest of your security program? Well, threat modeling should be addressed in the design phase. So as software is being developed, there's firstly a requirements analysis. So they're thinking about making a feature or they're thinking about making a certain product. That's where you start your risk assessment. But when they start to design the actual solution, that's when the threat modeling and design review should come in so that you have a quote shift left approach. You don't want to get the threat model after it's in release or it's in QA. That's too late. Now, granted, you can do threat models after the application or post threat models. And this is to do some type of tech debt or mature. If you want to mature a security program, then you can do it after the fact and go ahead and create essentially like a risk register of all of the things that have been found by threat modeling. Now, what are some of the best practices when conducting effective threat modeling sessions? Number one, you want to involve relevant stakeholders. You don't want to get people who are not attached to the product or project that you're working on. You want to get all the relevant stakeholders, the product people, the people who manage the application deployment, who manage the devs team, DevSecOps, networking. You want to have all those relevant stakeholders involved in the threat model, or at least one delegate from each group. And you want to use a structured approach. You don't want to fly off the wall, but you want to have a structured breakdown of how you're going to do the threat model. And we can easily do that by number one, defining the system's boundaries, assessing their vulnerabilities, identifying the threats using STRIDE, analyzing the impact of those potential threats that you just found, prioritizing the risk for mitigation, and developing mitigation strategies. Keep it structured like that or somewhere in between. As long as you can go through each of these steps, then that will keep you on track. You always want to keep the documentation and the findings in a good structured format. A lot of times you might just use Word just to document all the findings, some type of word processing document, or you can use even SharePoint or some searchable database type of register. And the thing with the threat model, you always want to review it, because when there's big changes to the application or the network, the threat model is going to change, and you don't want stale threat models just laying around because they're not doing you any good. So every time there's a major change, then you should redo a threat model on the part of the environment that has changed. So threat modeling should be a continuous process to address evolving threats, new threats that you may learn about as a security professional, and just review these with your regular documentation. Most companies do their documentation, they review it once a year. You're going to want to do it with that. And additionally, if there's a big change to a application or a system, maybe a whole different threat model that needs to be done. That's it for this video about threat modeling with the Stride framework. I left some links in the description about the Stride threat model, the Microsoft threat modeling tool, and some other tools that you can use to do threat modeling with. Like, share, and subscribe if you are interested in more cybersecurity content. Thanks for watching CyberSkill Pro.